Welcome everyone to this Monash Cybersecurity Seminar. Today we are very happy to welcome Chelsea Komlo from University of Waterloo and Zcash Foundation. Chelsea is a cryptography and privacy researcher. Currently she is a member of the Cryptography, Security and Privacy Lab at the University of Waterloo and also works as a principal researcher for the Zcash Foundation. Her current research interests involve multi-party zero-knowledge schemes in both classical and post-quantum settings, and they include threshold signatures in particular. And today's topic will also be about threshold signatures, and she will talk to us about threshold signatures with private accountability. Thank you, Chelsea. The scene is yours.
Great, thank you. Let me just share my screen. Oops, sorry about that. Let me pull up the right screen to share. Okay. Oops. Okay, you can see this, right?
Yep.
Okay, great.
Yep,
okay,
all good.
You can see it now, right?
Yep, all good. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. Great. Hi, everyone. I'm Chelsea Komlo, and I'm here to present joint work with Dan Bonnet, and it's on threshold signatures with private accountability. And one thing I just wanted to say is if you have questions during this talk, please stop me or comments or really anything. So it's kind of nice to have a back and forth. So I'm not just speaking to myself. So please ask questions or if you have clarifications or anything. So first of all, I want to introduce what a threshold signature scheme is, if you're not aware of what that is. So it's a public-private scheme, like what you'd think of for any public-private key pair scheme. And in this setting, there's one joint public key, but the private key is secret shared among some set of participants. So instead of having one private key that is owned by one signer, essentially that private key is split among a set of signers. And what's important here is that in order to perform signing, some subset of signers are required in order to issue a signature. So here we see a 2 out of 3 scheme. So in order to send some message, we need 2 signers to participate, and the third can be offline. And what those 2 signers do is they issue what we call signature shares, and then they send them to some other entity, which we call the combiner. Now, the combiner can actually be one of the signers if it wishes to. It can be a different entity. We assume it's a different entity just sort of for generality. And what that combiner does is it takes those signature shares and it combines them and it outputs a signature. So to the world, the signature looks like one party issued it, but really it required some set of signers to participate. And that's kind of in a nutshell what a threshold signature scheme does. And what's nice about a threshold signature scheme is that when participants perform signing, their secret share stays local to themselves. So they don't need to send secret key material over the wire. It all kind of stays local. And really what's only exchanged are these signature shares, which can be sent over a public channel. So that's what's nice is you don't actually send secret values around to each other. So in the literature today, there are 2 types of threshold signature schemes. And one thing we did in this work is we actually sort of give names to what these signature schemes are. So prior, these sort of existed, but they didn't have names describing what they did. And so the first scheme is what we call a private threshold scheme, or PTS. And this offers full privacy to the signers, which we'll see in a little bit. And the second scheme is what we call an accountable threshold scheme. And if you're familiar with threshold signature work, this is also known as an accountable subgroup multi-signature scheme, but we call an ATS just sort of for symmetry. So really you can sort of split threshold schemes into these 2 groups. And so what do we mean by a PTS or an ATS? Really what this falls into is who learns what information. So the two pieces of information that could be exposed in these types of schemes are the signer quorum or the threshold. So in the scheme that we saw before with 3 signers, 2 which were required to sign, the threshold in that setting was 2. And the signer quorum is the set of signers that participated in signing. So for PTS, once that signature is issued, the who learns the signing quorum and the threshold is only the signers. So the signers themselves know that the threshold. So if we go back and look at the scheme, basically, if you're one of the signers, you know that 2 of 3 are required in order to sign. So we can't really hide that information. But what we can hide once that signature is issued is who participated in signing. So for PTS, if you're signer 3, for example, and you look at the signature, here by process of elimination, you would know signers 1 and 2 participated. But if there are more signers, you wouldn't be able to tell. On the other hand, for an ATS, just by looking at that signature, you would be able to tell the signer quorum and the threshold. So just by looking at a signature, you'd be able to say, oh, signers 1 and 2 participated, and 2 out of the 3 are required in order to sign. So that's really how we distinguish between PTS and an ATS. So to sort of ground what we mean by a PTS and ATS, I'm going to segue into Schnorr threshold signatures, just to sort of illuminate really what we mean by these. So let's see how some existing multi-party Schnorr signature schemes meet these notions. So if you're not familiar with Schnorr, or if it's been a while, let's take a quick recap about what this means. So for Schnorr, single party Schnorr, you have a secret and public key. The verifier will ask to sign a message with respect to some public key. And what the signer does is it begins by generating a nonce, and then it generates the commitment to that nonce. It then generates the challenge, which is with respect to the commitment, the public key, and the message. And then the signature or the response is really just the nonce in combination with the challenge and the secret key. And then the signature is the commitment and the response, as well as the message that was signed. And to verify that signature, what the verifier does is it rederives the challenge, it derives what the commitment should be, and then it outputs whether or not the commitment that's in the signature is with respect to that derived commitment. So it's pretty simple. It's just a zero knowledge proof of knowledge of the secret key X sort of bound to this message by hashing it into the challenge using the fiat Shamir transform. So that's just a reminder of Schnorr signing. So I'm not going to go through all of threshold Schnorr signatures, but I just want to illuminate what we mean by PTS in the threshold Schnorr setting. And I'm using Frost as an example. So Frost is a threshold Schnorr signature scheme. And what's really the takeaway from this slide is that threshold signature schemes that rely on polynomial interpolation, i.e. Shamir secret sharing, are inherently a PTS. So in this case, Frost relies on Shamir secret sharing under the hood in order to distribute its secret key. And so that response that we saw before, so what Frost does is it outputs a Schnorr signature. So, but in the Frost setting, the way that this signature is generated is it's the sum of some responses by all these participants, where S here represents the set of signers. And really the takeaway is that the way that this response is generated is that it's using some nonce R in combination with the challenge, just like we saw with the plain Shamir secret or the plain Schnorr signature scheme. And then the secret keys that belong to each of the signing parties are summed with this funny lambda I. and this lambda I is the Lagrange coefficient. So that probably was a lot of words, but really what's happening here is for Schmier secret sharing, every secret key is a point on some secret polynomial, where the 0th point is the secret key. So really what's happening here is this sum of the lambda I skis. What this does is this evaluates to the secret key, which is really f of 0 on the secret polynomial. And if you kind of think about polynomial interpolation, what you get is essentially a signature that looks like this Z. So what polynomial interpolation does is it sums a bunch of values and it results in just this value, the secret key, which is just a point on some polynomial. And so given one point, you can't go back and say which points were used in order to interpolate to that point. So I guess really the summary from this is basically if you use polynomial interpolation, you interpolate to a point, and just by looking at that point, you can't say which points were used to interpolate to it, because any of the points on that line could be used to interpolate to any other single point. So if you're wondering what are these PTSs and where are they in practice, they're actually really everywhere where we use Schmier secret sharing under the hood for threshold signatures is sort of the takeaway. So interestingly, we already also have ATSs, and in the literature, an existing ATS is what is called MuSig2. So MuSig2 is an N out of N signature scheme, and its design is very similar to Frost. So in MuSig2, the response is again the sum of these responses from each of the signing participants. But here, the sum is with respect to the output of some hash function and all of the secret keys for all of the signers. So obviously, the key difference here is that we're not doing polynomial interpolation. And so this signature with this response Z will be valid with respect to some subset of public keys. So what this does is you might have a set of N public keys, and the signature will be valid with respect to the whatever N keys correspond to this SKI. And so in short, signers can be identified. So yeah, so really the key point here is that if polynomial interpolation is being used for a threshold signature, it's a PTS. For multi-signatures, well, because there's N signers, or even if you're doing a T out of N design, you can identify who the signers are. So that's just to show you that in the literature, there already are these schemes. Okay, so
I'm sorry, there is a question in the Q&A. Why is MuSig signature valid with respect to a subset of MuSig? Sorry, if MuSig is N out of N.
Yes, sorry. As I was saying this, I realized I slightly misdescribed this. So MuSig is N out of N. If you were to use it for a threshold scheme, for example, so you could very easily make this T out of N. If you publish the set of N keys, and then you just sort of enumerated to see which public key, which product of the subset was used for signing. And we use this fact later in our construction. So that's why I didn't explain this point very well. And really what I should have said here is that MuSig is described as an N out of N scheme, but you can very trivially make it a T out of N by, instead of publishing the product of these N keys, if you published all N of these keys, basically what the verifier would do is it would just, if you publish all N of these keys and the threshold, what the verifier would do is it would say, okay, I'm just going to check to make sure a subset of T of these keys were used in order to produce this signature. And then the public key in that case would be a subset. So in typing this, I really should have said it is designed as a multi-signature, but you can use it as an accountable threshold scheme as well.
Yeah,
Does that make
yeah, I
sense?
think, yeah, Nick says right things.
Okay, perfect. I'm glad you asked that because as I was describing it, I realized I didn't actually describe that very well. So thank you.
Can I also ask something on this? I was
Yeah.
thinking in my mind that like the difference between threshold signature and a multi-signature is that in threshold there is just one joint public key, while in
Yes.
music there is kind of like every user has their own individual public keys.
Yes.
Is this like a, I don't know if you have any formal definitions, but does this come up in your formal definition? If you have?
It doesn't, well, it's sort of baked into the construct. Well, it really depends, right? So if you used MUSIG as a threshold scheme, your public key would be a set of public keys and the threshold. So in that case, it is actually a threshold scheme. But your public key is one set of n public keys and whatever the threshold is supposed to be.
Yeah.
So it's not like it's not inherent. So yeah, I guess what I'm trying to say is that every signer does have their own individual public key, but the group is represented by a set of public keys. And that's actually very important. For a scheme like Frost, the public key is just one element because you're using polynomial interpolation. So the public key in Frost is just the generator raised to the secret key. So just G to the F of 0, but it all kind of works out under the hood because you're doing polynomial interpolation to a point, which corresponds to SK. So yeah, so the difference between like Frost and as a threshold scheme that uses polynomial interpolation and something like MUSIG, which does not, is really the size of the public key. So here the public key is just 1 point because we're using this interpolation trick. Here the public key is a set of n public keys plus the threshold.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Cool.
Yeah,
thank you for asking these. Okay, if that makes sense, then I'm going to move on, but please ask questions as we go. Okay, so in this work, sort of as you might have guessed, we introduce a new type of threshold signature scheme. So what this threshold signature scheme is it's both private and accountable, and we call it a TAPS. So like a PTS, the public, so anyone who's just looking at the signature after it's been published does not learn the threshold or the signing quorum. But like an ATS, the signing quorum can be recovered, but only by a designated entity. So if you didn't have this designated entity, a TAPS would be a PTS. But if you do have this designated entity, then it can be accountable, but only to this trusted party. So you might say, like, why would you bother in creating something like this? It sounds like just extending the literature. But actually, a TAPS has been quite, it was motivated by a real world requirement. And that was basically by, well, it started with looking at financial institutions who wanted to prove or disprove if they issued funds. So if you're a financial institution and let's say you share a secret key with your users, for example, your clients, you want to say whether or not you participated in issuing the funds with your client, or if your client issued their funds on their own. So basically what you're protecting against is your client saying, oh, you issued funds on my behalf and I didn't participate in doing that. So that's kind of a very real world example of where a TAPS is useful. And just kind of zooming out of what this gives you is it basically gives you some notion of post-compromise accountability. So if you think about threshold signatures, normally the threat model is protecting against some adversary who's allowed to control only up to some threshold of signers. So in a threshold scheme, we normally say, oh, the adversary is allowed to control up to the threshold -1 signers. And if that's the case, then the threshold scheme should be secure. If the adversary controls more than the threshold, traditionally we say like, oh, well, that's sort of out of the consideration of security. The scheme is totally broken. And what a TAPS gives you is it says like, okay, the scheme is, it does protect against only an adversary that controls up to T-1 signers, but it gives you accountability or some way to say after the fact who participated in doing something malicious. So it allows you to identify who the malicious signers are, even if it doesn't protect against an adversary that controls more than a threshold number of signers. And so that's nice. And that's something that we've seen in other domains as well, is saying like, okay, even if something bad happened, let's identify who did it. And that's sort of in a nutshell what a TAPS gives you. So sort of grounding, again, in this threshold scheme that we looked at in the 2 out of 3 example, the way that a TAPS works is, again, you have a message that comes in and you have a set of signers which issue signature shares to the combiner. And the combiner, again, issues a signature. But in this setting, the combiner creates an aggregated signature that proves T signers signed. So in addition to sort of aggregating the signature, it also produces a proof that demonstrates at least T of these signers participated. And then if that signature were to be input into this designated entity that we call the tracer is able to output which signers participated. But if anyone else were to look at the signature, they would not be able to do so. So really, it's only up to the tracer that can produce this information.
Can I ask you a question, Chelsea?
Sure. Yeah.
And does the combiner know who are the participants? Like, does the combiner know like delta 1 comes from the first and then delta 2 comes from the second participant?
It does. So it's the same model as we had before for the combiner. So again, a combiner could be a signer. But yeah, the combiner does know who produced signatures.
Yeah.
So it is, so it's trusted with privacy in this case, but it can't forge signatures.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. So kind of just building on this. So if you've heard of group signatures in the literature, basically what a group signature is essentially a special case of a TAPS where the threshold is equal to 1. So what a group signature gives you is it allows some signer within a group to issue a signature where that signature to anyone looks like anyone within the group produced that signature. But in a group signature setting, you are able to retroactively go back using the tracing entity to identify who issued the signature. So this sort of flow of using a combiner and a tracer, I guess in the group signature setting, you wouldn't have a combiner because it would just be one signer. But this sort of flow of issuing a signature that looks like anyone in the group issued it and then having a tracer, this exists in literature. It's called a group signature. But again, it's the special case of a TAPS. So for a TAPS, it essentially gives you the ability to allow that signature to be represented by more signers than just one. So thinking a little bit more formally about what a TAPS is, so it's a tuple of 5 algorithms, a keygen, sign, combine, verify, and trace algorithm. So in threshold signatures, normally we have keygen, sign, combine, and verify. So really this tracing algorithm is sort of what we add in addition, and the ability for all these other algorithms to generate something that can be traced. So a TAPS must be secure. So with respect to unforgeability, it must fulfill these notions of privacy that we talked about, and it must fulfill accountability. So kind of just stepping through every algorithm. So for key generation, you'll take the group's public key. It will output secret keys for each of the end participants. And then it will generate a secret key for the combiner and secret key for the tracer. And we show this in a centralized manner, but it could also be performed in a distributed setting. So this algorithm could be performed using a kind of like DKG-like approach. But we just show it here centralized for simplicity. For sign, it's exactly what you would expect for threshold signature. So it takes the message to be signed, the coalition of signers C. So this is the set of indices representing each of the signers. And it outputs a partial signature for this participant. So this partial signature is essentially this signature generated by this participant. And what combine does is it takes the set of these partial signatures and it outputs a TAPS signature. So very similar again to the plain threshold setting that we saw. It just takes in all of these partial signatures and outputs this joint signature. Verify is exactly what you would expect in a signature scheme. So it just takes public key, message, and signature, and it outputs a bit indicating if it's valid or not. And then for trace, what it does is it takes that TAPS signature, the message, and then the secret tracing key, and it outputs either the coalition of signers or it fails. So basically what it does is given that signature, and very importantly, its secret tracing key, it can recover that coalition of signers. But the secret tracing key is required in order to recover that coalition. And so, right, so we looked at each of the algorithms. So now let's look at the notions that a TAPS is actually required to provide. So the first notion is, as you would expect, for unforgeability. So we're working in the threshold scheme. So we assume that the adversary can be a participant. So in the unforgeability setting for a threshold scheme, we say the adversary is not only someone that can see signatures, it's also someone who can own secret keys and participate in the signing operation. But we assume that the adversary controls fewer than a threshold number of parties. And we say that the scheme is unforgeable if the adversary cannot output a valid signature, if it controls fewer than T parties. And then for accountability, we say that an adversary cannot output a valid signature that traces to an honest non-signer, or sort of conversely, an adversary cannot output a valid signature that does not represent the signing coalition. So I don't explain this extremely well here, but either the adversary can't frame a non-signer, and it shouldn't be able to claim that it did not participate in signing. So these two conditions have to hold. So let's look at the game and how the game actually works. So what's neat is we're actually able to encode the unforgeability and the accountability game in the same game. So we'll see how we're able to encode both notions within this game. So to start, what the adversary will do is it will pick the number of signers N, the threshold T, and it also picks the coalition of signers that it wants to corrupt. So in return, it will receive the public key, and then it will receive the secret keys for all of the signers that it wants to corrupt. And then the adversary is able to query the signing oracle, and what it returns is the signature shares for all of the signers that the adversary wishes to receive signature shares for. So what this is doing is the adversary is saying, okay, maybe I want to corrupt players 1 and 2, and then I can query for signature shares on any of the N participants. and I can receive signature shares back from them. And at the end, the adversary is required to output a valid forgery. So there's two win conditions in this game. So the adversary can win if it produces a valid signature and the coalition of signers that it corrupts is less than the threshold. So this is the unforgeability game. So if it outputs this valid forgery and the set C is less than the threshold, the scheme is unforgeable. The second win condition is that it outputs a valid signature that traces to an honest non-signer, which is our accountability game. So basically it outputs a valid signature that traces to someone that didn't sign is our second game. And a TAPS is unforgeable and accountable if the probability that the adversary wins is negligible. So then for privacy, we actually divide the privacy game or the privacy notion into two different notions. So the first notion is privacy against the public, which means that someone just looking at a signature is not able to learn anything about the threshold or the quorum of signers. So that's something that we talked about before. And then privacy against signers, as we spoke about before, is that the TAP signature should reveal nothing about who signed. Again, if I'm a signer, I will learn by process of elimination the threshold, so we can't really protect against that. But we can say if a signature is output, it should reveal nothing about who signed it. So for privacy against the public game, what the adversary will do is it will again choose a number of signers, and then it will generate two different thresholds. And then this key generation is performed with respect to a challenge threshold, where this bit B is chosen at random. And then the adversary learns the public key. And what the adversary can do is it can query with respect to a coalition of signers where C0 corresponds to the threshold T0 and C1 corresponds to the threshold T1, as I just said. And what combine will do, or what the output from this oracle is a TAPS signature that is made with respect to the challenge coalition CB. And then what the adversary can do is it can query the tracing oracle. But importantly, it can't query the tracing oracle on anything that was output from combine. So that's this restriction here. So basically an adversary can query for a TAPS signature, but it can't trace that particular TAPS, something that was honestly output. Otherwise, it would trivially learn the coalition CB. So that's the only restriction we have here. And we say that a TAPS is private against the public if it was able to gain any information about T. So essentially, this is a distinguishing game. And if the adversary can reliably guess the bit B, then the scheme is not private against the public. And so obviously in a distinguishing game, if it has a sort of non-negligible probability in guessing B, then it's not private. So then privacy against the signers, the game is very similar. But here, again, the adversary is allowed to learn T because it's a signer. And then in return, it actually gets secret keys for all of the signing parties, which is kind of interesting. And it is able to query the signing oracle, again, with respect to two different coalitions. These are with respect to the same threshold, but two different sets of signers. And again, it receives the output, a TAP signature, so the output from combine, with respect to one of these coalitions chosen at random. And again, it's able to query the tracing oracle, but not with anything that was output from O1. And its output is again a bit B. So again, we do have the same restriction. I can't query trace with anything that was a valid output from combine. And then we say that the scheme is private against signers if it can reliably distinguish between when the bit B is used. So again, this is a distinguishing game. And we say basically it shouldn't be able to learn anything about either one of these coalitions of signers. So those are our notions. Then what we do in this work is we present a generic scheme and then we present a Schnorr-based scheme. So I'll go through the generic scheme first, and then we'll look at the Schnorr-based scheme. And then we'll have a little bit of time for questions. But again, please interrupt me if you have any questions or if I'm going too quickly through something. So for our generic taps, what our generic taps construction actually does is the signature that's output from combine proves in generic zero knowledge that an encrypted ATS signature is valid. So basically under the hood, we use an ATS signature scheme. So we could use something like MUSIG2, like we talked about before, in this threshold setting. And basically what the signature does is it uses some generic zero knowledge system to prove that this signature is valid without saying who signed it or exposing any of that subset of public keys in the clear. And unlike when we were looking at MUSIG2, where the public key just had the threshold in the clear, this generic taps contains a commitment to the threshold. So it wouldn't actually expose the threshold in the clear, it would expose a commitment. And then what verification would do is it would say this encrypted ATS is valid with respect to this commitment to the threshold. And that's sort of the magic under the hood of how we're able to use an ATS, which is not private, but then add privacy on top so that we're able to achieve the properties of a PTS. So basically what in this generic taps setting, what the signature looks like is it includes some ciphertext, which is a public key encryption of an ATS signature to the tracer. So again, we might have this signature that's output in the clear, and then it's encrypted to the tracer. And then we include the zero knowledge proof that the ATS is valid. And then the combiner also produces a signature over the message, the ciphertext, and the proof. And we were required to do this because in our games, the adversary is allowed to query the tracing oracle. So we need some mechanism to say whether or not a query is with respect to a valid tap signature that was output by the combiner or by something that the adversary made up. So that's why, in addition, we require this tag. So I'm not going to go too much more into our generic scheme, but that's sort of it in a nutshell. So then we said, okay, we have this generic scheme, but it requires a generic zero knowledge system, which can be quite heavyweight. And especially if we wanted to create a taps around the Schnorr signature scheme, this generic zero knowledge system would actually be very expensive. And the reason for that, as we saw before, is a Schnorr signature requires the challenge to be derived from a hash function. So as we saw in the Schnorr signature scheme, the challenge is the hash of the commitment, the public key, and the message. And to prove that this challenge is derived correctly in generic zero knowledge would be expensive and heavyweight. So basically our goal in designing a Schnorr-based taps was to find something more efficient. And happily we are able to do so, but we do so by deviating actually from our generic construction. So as we saw before, a Schnorr signature is a tuple, the commitment, which is a commitment to a nonce, and then the response. And as we saw, basically the way that verification works is you derive the challenge, and then you check if the commitment that is in the signature is valid with respect to the response, the public key, and the challenge. So we saw this before, but just to kind of remind you how Schnorr signatures work. And basically, our insight for Schnorr is that publishing this commitment in the clear doesn't actually hurt privacy. So this R is just a commitment to a nonce. And so we can publish that in the clear, and only the response actually has to be protected. So for our Schnorr taps, we deviate a little bit from the generic scheme in that we also publish this commitment. And so the verifier is able to derive the challenge directly, which is much simpler. And so our proof is actually quite straightforward. So to sort of recap, and then I'll wrap up, and then we can go to questions. The way that our Schnorr taps works is for key generation, we use an ATS, and then the key pairs for the combiner and the tracer are also generated during keygen. For sign, every signer performs an ATS signing operation. Combine, again, this is using public key encryption. So the ATS is encrypted to the combiner's public key. And then this proof pi is generated that ensures that the encryption is correct. And it's also authenticated. For verification, it checks the correctness of pi relative to the verification key and the ATS public key. And then trace, using the tracing decryption key, it will decrypt the signature, or it will decrypt to obtain the signature. And then by looking at the signature, it can determine the coalition of signers. So in a nutshell, that's basically how our Schnorr taps works. And just to sort of, we don't have to go into every element here, but I just want to show you sort of how simplistic our relation is for this zero knowledge proof. So basically, in order to generate this proof pi, what the relation is it takes the generators, the LGML commitment to the threshold, the Schnorr commitment, the Schnorr challenge, this ciphertext, which is an encrypted ATS signature, randomizers, and then bits indicating which signer signed. So this is the inputs to generate the zero knowledge proof. And then our proof is very simple. So the first step is it proves that this response is valid for subset of public keys in this set of public keys. It proves that the ciphertext is a valid encryption to the tracer's public key. It proves that the signing quorum contains T signers, so that this is an actual threshold scheme. And then it proves, just sort of to ensure that the proof goes through, it proves that each bit is 0 or 1. So we need to do this just to make sure that the rest of the proof holds. But what's nice here, again, is we don't have to prove that any sort of hash or anything is valid. It's just going over scalars and group elements. So the actual proof is very simplistic. So because the proof is simplistic, we're able to do 2 instantiations of the zero knowledge proof system. We're able to use just plain Sigma protocols, and then we're also able to use bullet proofs. And the reason why we chose both of these systems is because they reduce to discrete logarithm assumptions. So obviously using Sigma protocols is a little bit less efficient, but it's actually not too bad for small values of T and N. Bullet proofs, there is an overhead, but for larger values of T and N, it becomes more efficient. So if you're using taps with like a 2 out of 3 scheme, the Sigma-based zero knowledge system might be more efficient. For large values of T and N, bullet proofs is probably a little bit more efficient. So I know we talked about a lot in this talk. So the overall takeaways that we have are that we introduced the taps. This is a new type of threshold signature, and it is able to ensure both privacy and accountability. Whereas in the literature before, schemes provided one or the other, but not both. We then define a generic construction that employs an encrypted ATS. And then we also define a Schnorr construction. But what's nice is we do deviate from our generic construction a bit in order to have a simpler zero knowledge statement. And then we define sigma and bulletproof instantiations for our zero knowledge arguments. Some might be better in low settings of TNN, and bulletproof or sigma protocols are better in for low TNN, and bulletproofs are better for large TNN. And that's everything we do in this work. So yeah, we can go through questions now.
Thank you very much, Chelsea, for your very interesting talk. I've got a few questions, but I'll ask if anyone else has. I'll start one of mine, and in the meanwhile, the others can prepare their questions. Hey, can you go to page 25?
Sure, let me.
Or even this one. 25.
Oh, sorry, this one?
So the R here, the capital R here, this is like the combined commitment. Is that the case?
Yes. So this is, if you think about, so an ATS is essentially like, you can think of it as a multi-signature in this threshold setting that we looked at before. So this R is the combined commitment from all of the signers.
Ah, okay.
And this Z here is the combined response from all of the signers.
Yeah. Okay.
So you can see why, yes. So if the Z were released in the clear, it would leak basically the threshold and the signing quorum as well. So this product of PKIs raised to the BIs, that's essentially indicating the subset of signers. So this is sort of getting to that product of public keys that we talked about before.
Yeah. But why does Z leak the threshold? Isn't Z effectively just a random element because it's masked by R?
So, right. So basically the public key, I should have said this, but the public key in this scheme is the set of n public keys along with the commitment to the threshold. So if I know the set of n public keys, NZ, I'm able to enumerate through and produce whatever subset that Z is valid with respect to. So if Z is signed by signers 1 and 2, it would be valid with respect to the public keys for signers 1 and 2.
Ah, I see. Okay. Okay, yeah.
So what the proof does is it gives you all n of the keys, but then it says in zero knowledge, these bits BIs, which are either turning on or off the public keys, those are secret. So those are part of the witness.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. There's it. Okay, there are 2 questions in the Q&A by Nick. Does the security proof rely on the simplified Schnorr construction? Could it be done with standard Schnorr, or would it be insanely complex to prove the challenge hash?
I'm not sure. Sorry, do you mind reading the question again?
So the question says, does the security proof rely on the simplified Schnorr construction? Could it be done with standard Schnorr, or would it be insanely complex to prove the challenge hash?
I'm not sure what you mean by simplified versus standard Schnorr. So one is proving that Z is a valid Schnorr signature. But the verifier derives this challenge directly. So, so this is a standard Schnorr signature. But as you can see, this challenge is sort of derived by the verifier directly because we're able to expose R in the clear. So maybe you can clarify what you mean by simplified Schnorr, but this is a valid Schnorr signature.
Yeah.
It's a valid,
Nick,
I guess,
says, yeah, that makes sense.
Okay, cool. Yeah, it's a valid multi-party Schnorr signature, but if you think about the public key as being some subset, it's valid with respect to a subset of public keys in this larger public key. So it's valid Schnorr with some extra checks on top of it.
Yeah, Nick has another question. Is the tracer secret key completely different to the other secret keys in the group? Or can the tracer also sign towards the threshold?
So we assume that the tracer is a separate entity, again, just for generality. You could have the tracer also be a signer. There's no reason why it couldn't be. But we just sort of model the combiner and the tracer as external for generality. But you could have an entity which is the signer and also holds the tracing secret key.
Yeah. Any other questions from anyone else?
Hi, I'm a PhD student at Monash. I just have a couple of questions. Maybe it's kind of like silly. So I wonder
Silly questions.
I wonder what's the difference from PTS and threshold ring signature.
Oh, so for a ring signature, the set of signers can be anyone.
Yep.
For a PTS and an ATS, it's important that the signers are within some predetermined group. So for a ring signature, just to kind of remind you, what it's saying is, I can produce a signature that's signed by either myself or Michelle Obama, and like you can't tell who signed it, but you know either one of us signed it.
Yep.
For here, what this is saying is it's saying for some predetermined group, you are sure, but that group stays the same sort of throughout time.
Right.
So this public key is sort of determined for some set of authorized signers. They're very close, but the way threshold signatures are generally used is you have some set of N parties who are supposed to be trusted. And then the signature is valid with respect to some subset of them. It's really kind of, I guess, the setting in which you use them.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, it looks like really similar concepts to me. Yeah. Right. And another question is because I think you mentioned previously that TAPS is a little bit similar to group signatures, but group signature can only sign like one message per person. It's not a threshold signature scheme, right?
So yeah, a group signature represents one signer.
Yeah.
And a TAPS can represent, it represents T signers.
Yeah.
And it's important that at least or at minimum T sign.
Yeah. I'm wondering like if TAPS can also be constructed from like a group signature plus an aggregate signature. Say an aggregator can aggregate, for example, T signatures that generated by T group signers, and then produce a TAPS signature that proves that there are exactly T signers signed this message from the group.
Yeah, so we looked at group signatures and we tried to extend some in the literature, and just from their structure, like how these signatures are generated, we were not able to easily extend them.
Right.
Perhaps like this is like the first in its work, so I'm sure, hopefully this kind of gets picked up and built upon, and maybe someone does find a group signature which is easily extensible, but we tried and the math was just not, it was extremely complicated, just the way that they were constructed. Yeah. So this was the simplest construction we could come up with.
Awesome, awesome. Thank you. Great talk. Thank you.
Thank you. I guess some other open problems, as you noticed here. So like the signature size in these is with respect to the number of parties. So I guess in the bulletproofs case, it's a little better, but the public key is also it. So here our public key represents all n parties. So some follow-up work, like we couldn't find a great way to design a construction where the public key stayed constant with respect to the number of parties, but that's also follow-up work that might be interesting.
Yeah. Any other questions from anyone?
Yes, can I ask a question? Yeah, thanks for the nice talk. Yeah, I was wondering, in your model, you have this private key for the combiner. So what is the main reason for why the combiner can't be public? I mean, keyless.
Yeah, so the main reason is because in our security notions, we have this requirement. So we allow the adversary to query the tracing entity. And if the adversary was able to query with anything, they might be able to trivially win this game. So yeah, so basically it just ensures that the adversary can't trivially win if it doesn't have the combiner secret. So it ensures that we can check if the adversary is querying with a valid taps or with something that it generated itself. So it's for generality, and it's the best way we could find to ensure this property, essentially.
I see. So it comes in only in the privacy game, or
Yes.
okay, yeah. All right, thank you.
Yeah. So again, it might be interesting to look at this and say, like, if you didn't have the combiners, if the combiner didn't require a private key, maybe there's trade-offs that are acceptable in certain settings. So
yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yes.
Anyone else with any questions? Okay, I'll ask my questions quickly because we're running out of time. One is very simple. I'm just wondering why it's called taps but not pets.
Yeah. I don't know. Taps just seemed nicer. Like
Okay.
we debated between the two, and we just thought Taps was a nicer name. So
Yeah, the other question, my last question is, as far as I can see, the trace did not have any kind of zero knowledge proof or correct decryption. Don't you need to have this to ensure this non-frameability? Because like the tracer can just decrypt and say, they can just say this random set is the output of the decryption, even though they actually did not do any decryption.
yeah, so again, it cannot authenticate that the input is output from the combiner. So that is one mechanism that it uses to ensure that like the input is correct. And then after that, you do rely on the encryption scheme to ensure that it's correct. So, but you can say at least that the input to Taps is generated by the combiner, which is trusted to generate this proof and the encryption correctly.
Yeah, but the tracer can take the encrypted value. It may just not do anything, and then it can just say, like, these set of users are the designers.
Oh, right. So yeah, so yes, so in this case, we do not have trace outputting proof, but you could extend this so that the tracer outputs proof. But whoever outputs proof to, I guess, like, also needs to be trusted with privacy. So, but yeah, you could change it so that it outputs proof that it did its check correctly.
Okay.
So, but yeah, again, there's definitely follow-up work that could be done. So this is sort of the first in this kind of notion. So there's definitely things that could be done to make it better for certain settings in practice.
Yep. Right. I think the time is kind of up. Thank you very much, Chelsea, for your very interesting talk. Thank you everyone for tuning in. Hope to see everyone in the next seminar.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.